YouTube, it's Michael from Mirrors of Consciousness and creator of the Orbifold Tarot. This is a follow-up video to actually a few videos that I've been doing recently that hopefully will tie in a few concepts about the Orbifold Tarot. It's part 2 of reading with the Orbifold, how to read with the Orbifold, specifically looking at court cards. And the perspective on how to look at court cards will also tie in some ideas that I introduced theoretically in the video, What is an Orbifold? So you might want to start with that if you haven't seen it already. And it continues some ideas about how to look at the elements and elemental interactions in casting a circle with the Orbifold. So you might want to check that one out as well. And so in the meantime, I'm going to pause the video and turn it around so I can visually show you what I'm talking about. And you may want to pause the video as well and check out those other 2 videos first, What is an Orbifold and Casting a Circle with the Orbifold Tarot. So one way of looking at the court cards is by rank, and ranking them from page at the lowest rank through the knight, next rank, queen, next rank, to the king as being the highest rank. Or possibly looking, splitting them into an upper pair and a lower pair. So you might have the page and the knight as more youthful aspects of the court, and the queen and the king as more mature aspects of the court. This is fine enough because, of course, we have more mature people in our lives and less mature people in our lives, and sometimes that doesn't mean that they're quote-unquote immature, as in childish, but we all have different endeavors that we are more mature in, and other endeavors that we're less mature in. So we could be, well into our adulthood, but when we approach a new endeavor, we are more like a page or a knight in that new endeavor. We're younger, in a sense. We're more inexperienced in that endeavor than in other ones where we're more like the queen or the king, or both. In this particular arrangement, you can see, though, that there is a definite yin side, or more feminine side. The page and the queen are on that side, and a more masculine, active aspect with the elements of fire and air on this side, which, of course, they could reverse. It doesn't have to be that the masculine side, the yang side, has to be on the right, and the feminine side has to be on the left. It's completely interchangeable. So in the same sense that the masculine and feminine properties are interchangeable left and right, we can think that the mature, or rather the immature and the mature aspects, the upper and lower ranks, are also interchangeable. We can take that a couple of steps further and think of the court more as a single rank, but different aspects of that single rank. So we go from earth, through water, through fire, to air. And that order is relatively arbitrary. It doesn't have to go in that order from earth to air. But if we think of the elements now, and not so much the people they represent, but the elements themselves as being more dense toward the earth side and less dense toward the air side, then we have this progression back and forth between air, through fire, through water to earth, from earth through water, through fire to air. And it goes really back and forth. So it's more like that orbifold concept through the elements, that once we reach this side, we actually continue in a loop and that loop can actually change directions. So then we can think of the quartz as the completion of the cycle of their specific element. So here we have, and sorry about the glare, I already did something about the glare, but it didn't completely work. So we can think of the quartz as the completion of a cycle in their particular element. So we have ace, 2, 3, 4, I'll try to get them all on screen, 5, 6, 7, overlap them a bit, 7, you get the idea, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we're going all the way through the cycle of air, in this case, from ace through 10. And so we can actually think of the court card, each court card, as one variation of the completion of that element, one variation of the 10 containing the ace here of the next progression, the next cycle. So the page of air is actually containing the ace of earth. It's the completion. It's almost like it's the 10 of air, the completion of the cycle of air, and because it's a cycle of air that is complete, the page is actually ready to move on to another cycle of earth. And then the queen of air is ready, she's holding the ace of water, so she's ready to move on through a cycle of water. The knight is ready to move on through a cycle of fire. The king is ready to move on through another cycle of air, because maybe the cycle, even though it was complete, maybe everything wasn't explored in that cycle, and the cycle has to be repeated. So that's one way of thinking of the court, is that the page is the start of a new cycle of earth after completing the element that it's ruling over. The queen is the start of a new cycle of water after its completion of its own element, and so on all the way up. So here's just another way of visually looking at that progression from ace all the way through 10, then we reach the 10, and then we are faced with these 4 possible paths for the next cycle: the earth path, the water path, the fire path, or the air path. The air path would loop back again and return here to go through the sequence. The fire path would then continue on ace, 2, 3, so on in fire. And so every time one of those court cards comes up, a singular court card, let's do a different suit. So let's say it's the queen of fire. We can think of that in some ways as being the completion. It's not really a 10 of fire, but it's after completing the 10 of fire, she's moving on then from the 10 of fire to the ace of water, to begin a water cycle. And that is very much in keeping with actually the traditional definitions of these cards. The Queen of Fire, for instance, would be a person who has mastered action. She's or he, because of course they're non-gender specific. I'm saying she because it's the more yin aspect, which we all contain, male or female. So the Queen of Fire has attained a certain level of mastery over action, over the various qualities of the fire element. And she's interested, she's also got within her some water qualities, some of the aspects of feeling. She maybe is, in a sense, the beginner, the novice of water. Always, she's kind of the novice of water. Or a different way to look at that, similar but different, is that all the queens are always containing an aspect of water, perhaps because they've matured through the water cycle so deeply that they actually contain that seed of water within them. Which actually gets to another aspect where sometimes it's less useful to look at the court cards, it's more useful to look at the court cards as including the ace. So if we go back to our air court, we can think of the ace of air as also being one of the court cards. And I've just kind of arbitrarily arranged these for now. They're actually, I'll place them in a different order in a moment. But the ace is the court card that is a little bit more neutral within its element. Whereas the other court cards have gone in a different direction from that element. Which ties in a little bit to what we looked at with casting a circle using the Orbifold, where air was east. Let's rearrange those now. Air was east, so the king of air is in the east position. Oops, sorry about that. My table is moving. Air was in the east position. Fire was in the south position. Water was in the west position. And earth was in the north position. So the ace is kind of in the middle of its own element. When it moves to the king, it's moving further over into its element, further to the east in its own direction. When the ace goes through the cycle to become a knight, or the relationship between the knight and the ace, is that the knight is moving southerly, further into fire. Rather than staying with air or moving more deeply into air, the knight is moving more into fire, and so on around the circle. There's one other little aspect about that relationship that might be useful to you in some readings, which is this difference in the shading of the orbs in the ace compared to the rest of the court cards. So you may already have noticed that the shading in the court cards is as though the light is coming down from above, and in this case my glare is kind of helping illustrate the point there. And the ace, the glare is coming either from the center of the orb outward, or is as though the light is looking at the ace squarely, or that the ace is looking at the light squarely backward, because there's that two-way relationship. In this way, the ace is squarely facing the situation from its element alone, from its pure elemental standing alone, and from the root of its element. It doesn't necessarily have the complete cycle, the maturity of the element as the king might have. Whereas the other courts, they have fully absorbed the element so completely that they're able to contain a second element within them. Or, in the case of the king of air, or it would be the knight of fire, and so on, where each court card is in its own element. That would be the ability to contain both the root of the element and the element's completion, so joining together both in a full cycle. So we have then this idea of being able to branch off from the completion of one element into the next element in each cycle. And of course, at the end of these cycles, we then have that same ability to branch off into any of the four. Let me move those over a little bit. Any of those four elements again. So it's this continual cycling through the elements over and over and over again. How does that relate to reading? Well, let's say the page of fire comes up. The page of fire could be signifying, okay, you've mastered fire. You've certainly got, you know how to act on things, you know how to get things done, you have lots of drive, you have lots of inspiration. Now it may be time to look at how you can take that inspiration, that drive, and that ability to do things and to take action. And it may now be time to filter that action into fire, into earth. You may need to explore the earth cycle. Same thing with the queen. It could be that, okay, you've mastered all those things with the page, but now it may be time to explore that, explore how to apply or how to integrate action with emotion. Sometimes we're so busy doing things, so busy acting on our impulses and following our drives, that we lose touch with our emotional field. Or sometimes that active nature, that ability to be very active and very driven around things, sometimes it's actually a way for us not to experience, not to feel emotion and sensations. So then, instead of action, fire being a matter of action, fire is actually, in this case, being reaction, a reaction to things. And you may be a very reactive individual that has not yet mastered the water realm, the emotional realm. And same thing, night comes up, it may be, okay, you're very good at one aspect of the fire cycle, but maybe you need to look at another aspect of the fire cycle, or maybe it needs to be refined further. So you are certainly good at doing things or getting things done or being very driven, but maybe you need to look at how to refine the way that you do those things in a more efficient way. And so on, right? Then we get back to the King of Earth. And really that's what our experience in life is like, is we reach some level of mastery in some aspect of our lives, and then we have to return to another aspect, another cycle that we may have thought we had mastery over, or it may have seemed like we had mastery over at the time, but in the end, maybe we could have refined that mastery a little bit more. And so this ties into our orbifolds of going around and around in circles, around in loops, but even though it seems like you've come back to the start of a loop, back to the start of a cycle, it isn't really. It's the start of a similar cycle, a familiar cycle, but it's a whole new one. It's a whole new loop. And it just loops around and around and around in all directions, from ace to 10, from 10 to ace, from fire to water to air to earth, and all through them, and they eventually get mixed up together. And when you reach some level of mastery over those elements, or conversely, we can also think about it as going back to the root of the elements. So that's a different way of thinking about it too, that the court cards, as I think I started to explain earlier, but then I got sidetracked. We can actually think of the court cards in a way, not so much as the completion, the finality of the 10, but instead the court cards could be viewed as what happens as you move down the cycle from 10 to ace, and once you reach the ace, then there's an ability to include another element. So we'll just lay those out for a moment. And so that idea of completing cycles and returning to cycles and merging, really integrating all of the various aspects of ourselves, the 10 of cups, the 2 of earth, the 3 of fire, all of those aspects and what they represent, the more we go through the cycle and we repeat and repeat and repeat, the more we're actually integrating each of those aspects together into various major cards, in particular things like manifestation, or things like the wheel. The wheel is very much exactly what I've been talking about going round and round in circles. Or the void. The world. The world and the void are kind of actually related. In a way, the void happens when all of the elements are integrated and all of the elements are together, but they're so well integrated and then they're so together that they're no longer differentiated. They're no longer recognizable as individual elements, which gives a slightly different look at the death card as well. You can think of the death card as being the integration of all elements in such a way that that integration leads to a non-differentiation of the elements. They're so integrated, they're so together that they're no longer recognizable as singular elements, and they're returning to that unmanifest quality. So I hope that's not too confusing a way to think about court cards. It was intended to clarify, but if I confused you more, you can forget everything I said. But I just want to leave you with a slight other interpretation of this circle spread, and return to that, where we've got earth in the north, air in the east, fire in the south, and water in the west, with the court cards arranged so that earth of air is in the northeastern part, the air of air is in the eastern part, Knight of Air is in the southeastern part, and Queen of Air, this is very contradictory, is in the west-eastern part. And they come together. And so then we actually have some majors that incorporate these elements and combine them. We've already talked a little bit about the ones that involve 4 elements. So manifestation, the world, the magician, the wheel, and the world, all working together to combine all the elements. And I already talked a little bit about the void and death as being that combination of all elements to such a degree that the elements are no longer recognizable, because that's really what will happen in the center. If we think of the manifestation card, or even the magician, as that coming together of all the elements, you can see the seed of the void is inside the magician. It happens, that seed happens as all 4 elements really truly combine. And then possibly, if we zoomed into the void and we entered the void very deeply so that it blew up bigger, then we might have the death card come up next. or the death card might be contained within the void. But let's go on to some of the majors that can also be placed on this same directional wheel. We can have the High Priestess as combining water and fire, and water and fire also combining in a way that they are shades of the void. Also in that direction, we have the Lovers, which combine water and fire as well, but it's a little bit more interactive in that way. Won't go into it too much further than that, but I'll leave it at that so we can get to some other ones. Strength is the combination of fire and air, as I discussed a little bit in the reading with the Orbifold video, as is the Sun. So these two cards would go in the southeast position. The High Priestess and the Lovers would go in the southwest position. Continuing around the circle, we then might have the Chariot in the Chariot in the northeast position, as well as Judgment in the northeast position. The Hermit in the northwest position, combining earth and water. And the Star also in the northwest position. So those are two element combinations. We could also have the Moon in the west position. Depends on what part of the world you're in, but I always observe the Moon looking westward out of my window. And then we could have Judgment in the north position, the earth position. The Fool, where did my Fool go? A wonderful Fool. The Fool in the east position. The Devil in the south position. Slightly different way of thinking of the cards and the elements, but you can see how this wheel of elements goes around and around, wheel of directions as well. Then we have three element combinations of fire, earth, and water, the Empress coming into there. The Hanged One coming into here. Let's turn that just a bit, just so it's square. The Hanged One combining water, earth, and air. The Tower coming in, combining earth, fire, and air. And finally, Temperance coming in, combining air, the east, the south, fire, the west, water. And in the center, two cards that combine the south and the north, the Emperor with fire and earth, and the card that combines east and west, the Hierophant. Wouldn't that be wonderful, actually, if the Hierophant really would combine Eastern and Western theology, East and West philosophy, East and West religion. Not that I'm so big a fan of the religion, but the philosophies behind them are wonderful. If the Hierophant really could combine those two, I think we'd be in a much better place in this world. So a different way of looking at the elements, the court cards relative to the directions on the cardinal directions relative to the elements and the combinations of those directions with the elements, and then tying that into circular cycles, spherical cycles, and how to use the elements and the majors relative to that similar kind of relationship between direction and element. So again, these are all just different perspectives on how to think about things. If the different perspective works for you, and if you can apply it in some useful way in your readings, fantastic, or even if it just develops a deeper understanding of the cards and their interactions with each other from a study perspective, great. And if it all kind of doesn't make sense to you, or doesn't resonate for you, or plainly doesn't make sense, then of course I invite you to find your own ways to work with the Orbifold and the Orbifold's system and imagery of elements and number in a way that works for you. I would be very curious, though, to know what you find, so please, by all means, join me on Eclectic Tarot for the discussions on the Orbifold. Join me here on YouTube with your own comments, and as the decks are released, with your own methods with the deck. And also find me on Facebook in some of the forums, or on Mirrors of Consciousness, where we can discuss different ideas and different challenges that you've encountered in working with or thinking about the deck. And hopefully we can all find a way that helps us grow, not only in how we interpret the Orbifold Tarot, but also in how we interpret tarot and work with tarot in general.